acknowledge the young ones amongst us who are going to carry our message forward. But in the process of putting this together and getting closer and closer, the news about Iceland came out, and I realized we hadn't really addressed that. And I think I've always been inclusive and wanted to, we've taken our symposium around the world, but I want, and often people come back here as well with us. But I would, again, recognize that we didn't have anybody from the UK to address these issues. And there's one special person who I met at Keele University a few years ago, and you can read about his bio and his abstract because they're wonderful, both of them. So I wrote to him and asked, I wrote to Antony Lempert and asked him, where are you? If he'd be willing to come. And he said, well, I'll ask my family, because it's my birthday weekend and I don't know if they're going to want me to come. Today is his birthday, and he's here.
Should we sing happy birthday?
He has his finger on the pulse of what's going on in Europe and he'll let us know.
Is it? Yeah, lovely. Well, I'm so honoured and moved to have been invited to speak here and spend my birthday weekend laughing, debating and weeping with you all. I haven't really quite expected to weep quite so much, so thank you, Marlene, for that. In 1935, an Austrian physicist postulated a famous thought experiment. His intention was to highlight the absurdity of the prevailing view of quantum physics, in which quantum particles were thought to exist as a combination of multiple different states. I've come to a quantum physics discussion, haven't I? No, okay. The thought experiment described a cat in a box that may be both alive and dead simultaneously. Schrodinger's cat popped into existence, or not. In Europe, recent debates about non-therapeutic forced genital cutting are stretching the imagination in much the same way. Schrodinger's cat may be even wilier and long-lived than initially thought, and may not even look like a cat. I'm going to take you on a selective tour through a few recent European developments, naturally from a European perspective, where my day job is as a GP, a family doctor. Now, in Europe, unlike here across the pond, most doctors have seen no reason to medicalise non-therapeutic male circumcision, which is largely, though not exclusively, confined to large parts of the Jewish and Muslim communities. That's not to say that it's any better regulated in most of Europe, where, with a few notable exceptions, there's very little regulation, particularly for non-medics. For example, in the UK, in 2016, Dr. Hassan Abdullah was suspended from the medical register after performing non-therapeutic circumcisions on children. Dr. Abdullah's problems began not because he was a psychiatrist, but when his premises were inspected by the English Inspectorate of Healthcare Provisions, the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, he was found to have out-of-date equipment, potentially dangerous facilities, and support staff inappropriately trained. In the UK, though, a significant proportion of infant genital cutting takes place in private homes by non-doctors, with no regulation. And many serious complications have been reported, including that of a child sustaining a skull fracture falling off a kitchen table during a circumcision procedure in Bristol. The CQC, though, has no remit to inspect private homes. So we have premises that are used to perform recognised surgical procedures for which doctors would need to be appropriately trained, and they're simultaneously both surgical premises and not surgical premises, just so long as the surgeon is not even a doctor. And I'll call these Schrodinger's surgical premises. The irony for Dr. Abdullah is that his best hope of continuing to perform non-therapeutic surgery would be for him to be struck off the UK medical register completely. Because as a layperson, he would then be free to cut boys' genitals without any medical inspections of his premises, nor scrutiny of his surgical prowess as a putative psychiatric children's genital surgeon. So let's leave Dr. Abdullah here and move on to the wider discussion. And perhaps keep Schrödinger's cat in mind, though, as an aid to understanding some of the more otherwise baffling objections to protecting boys from non-therapeutic genital cutting, particularly when those objections come from people outside the cutting communities. Over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been significant change in many European countries in our approach to and understanding of child safeguarding. There's an increased recognition that children are independent rights holders, entitled to be listened to be protected from harm, to form their own beliefs, and entitled to learn about and express their own sexuality. Yet, frequent major failures of child safeguarding take place, inevitably followed by blame, public hand-wringing, promises to learn lessons, and that it'll never happen again, they say, each time. The problem is that it is happening right now. Cutting children's genitals for no medical reason, when it's impossible to second-guess a child's later beliefs or values, is a very serious child safeguarding matter. So the challenge is to understand why it keeps happening and how we can develop everyone's understanding of child safeguarding to overcome the barriers that fail children. Two of the major barriers to any change are fear of criticism and status quo bias. In order to preserve the status quo, people will often go to extraordinary lengths to convince themselves that there's no need to change. Add to the mix vested interest groups, particularly those with traditional privileges and those who claim persecution, and it can be more challenging still to effect change. So I'll run through a few salient developments and anomalies. In 2001, Sweden passed legislation with the intention of increasing the safety of circumcision. All operators should be certified, all children should have anaesthetic, and those over 2 months old should only be operated on by a physician. Despite this legislation being permissive of forced cutting in general, and Britain in particular, the World Jewish Congress criticised it, calling it the first legal restriction on Jewish religious practice since the Nazi era. And 4 years later, the Swedish Health Board noted that the legislation had failed. Safety hadn't improved, and non-certified operators were still practising. In 2006, the British Medical Association issued guidance, and they stated that unnecessarily invasive procedures should not be used where alternative, less invasive techniques are equally efficient and available. Therefore, to circumcise for therapeutic reasons, where medical research has shown other techniques to be at least as effective and less invasive, would be unethical and inappropriate. So far, so good, but on non-therapeutic circumcision, the BMA has no policy on these issues. So what's going on here? We have a questionable therapeutic surgical procedure, circumcision, minus even the dubious therapeutic rationale, and it transforms into a non-event rather than an assault. Schrödinger's ethics blink and they're gone. One could almost have some sympathy for the BMA in taking this position. After all, the BMA is a trade union that represents doctors, not lay people. I say almost because integral to and inseparable from the role of a doctor in treating people is to protect vulnerable people. And I might add that I am a BMA representative, though for obvious reasons I'm not speaking in that capacity today, sadly. Other European medical associations and children's ombudsmen have shown more clarity. In 2010, as we know, the Royal Dutch Medical Association, KNMG, adopted an official viewpoint of deterrence with broad support from medical associations within the Netherlands. They said non-therapeutic circumcision of male minors conflicts with the child's right to autonomy and physical integrity. In 2013, all 5 children's ombudsmen of the Nordic countries, together with paediatric experts, issued a joint statement headlined, "Let the boys decide on ritual circumcision." And they said that circumcision without medical indication conflicts with Articles 12 and 24(3) of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which guarantees the child the right to express their own views and to be protected from traditional harms. We see it as fundamental, the Ombudsman stated, that parents' rights in this context don't prevail over children's right to bodily integrity. The best interest of the child must always be a primary consideration, even if this can reduce the rights of adults to perform religious or traditional procedures. And most recently, 18 months ago, the Danish Medical Association said that circumcision of boys without a medical indication is ethically unacceptable when the procedure is carried out without the informed consent of the person undergoing surgery, so it shouldn't take place under 18 years old. Now, in January 2010, 4 months before the Dutch position was announced, I was granted a meeting with Jane, the head of ethics at the General Medical Council, which is the UK doctors' regulatory body. Jane, somewhat reluctantly, agreed with me on practically every point, which wasn't surprising since I was largely quoting from the GMC's own excellent guidance, including this excellent sage advice to consider which option, including the option not to treat, would be least restrictive of a patient's future choices. And GMC guidance would have protected boys were it not for their explicit statement, we have no policy on ritual male circumcision. And then out came the trump card, if I may say that over here. I had no idea, I was told, how offended the chief rabbi would be were they to change their policy, or non-policy. And this was a line repeated to colleagues who visited 2 years later. And more recent labyrinthine GMC guidance on this subject advises doctors now that we must take into consideration parents' religious beliefs when discussing this, which signally avoids any recognition of the increasing heterogeneity both of children's own later beliefs and of the variety of practices within beliefs. It appears that the decisions around medical ethics and interventions on UK children are premised on the sensitivities of organised religion and its leaders, the Jewish religion specifically. Maybe in 60 years it'll change, said Jane. No doubt followed by hand-wringing, apologies, lessons learned, and never again, they'll say again. Yet many doctors and regulatory authorities already do understand that children's rights are necessarily independent of the culture of birth. So what else is going on? After all, medical practice is to treat and prevent illness or disease. The first rule of medicine drummed into every first-year medical student is primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Iatrogenic harm, the harm that we cause by our medical interventions, plays no small part in morbidity and mortality at the best of times. How much more so when there's no illness to treat or prevent? How do we explain the reason why not all European medical associations and regulatory bodies have recognised all forms of forced genital cutting as harmful? Well, in predominantly non-cutting cultures, such as the majority of Europe, it's not a subject that dominates medical or parental discussions. Most doctors will have little or no experience. When the subject does come up though, there's often a curious response that male circumcision can have medical benefits. Now, remember the context. No official European medical body is suggesting that ritual circumcision carries more benefits than harms, and none actively recommend it. Performing it for therapeutic reasons would transform it by definition from non-therapeutic to therapeutic, which is a different consideration entirely. So the argument that I hear goes like this. A defined surgical procedure can have medical benefits in certain circumstances. Circumcision can be done for medical reasons. Doesn't the World Health Organization promote it? And doesn't it help protect women from cervical cancer? And it's very important to Jews and Muslims. And you shake all this together without focusing on the evidence or the ethics. Listen attentively to the words of Jewish and Muslim leaders citing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and we can see how forced genital cutting becomes wrapped up and interlinked in a complicated, perhaps even a quantum leap of faith way with therapeutic circumcision. And with a little bit more artistic license, which I hope you'll grant me, I call this phenomenon Schrodinger's penis. which pops up here for the first time to enable two diametrically opposed topics to merge into one quite confusing concept. Now, the full extent of the Schrodinger's penis phenomenon has become apparent to me only quite recently during an interaction I had with a man called Jonathan. Jonathan is the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the representative body and official advocate for Jews in the United Kingdom. It was our third meeting. Our first meeting was 6 years ago, during a BBC television debate to discuss the Cologne verdict in May 2012, which, as you know, was against a German doctor who'd circumcised a 4-year-old boy of Muslim parentage who'd suffered bleeding and scarring complications. The judge ruled the child had been too young to give his consent. The parents didn't have the authority to consent on his behalf to a procedure that would lead to his body being permanently and irreparably changed and that could affect his own religious interests later. As we know, the doctor wasn't convicted because the practice was so common. Now, despite the facts of the inevitable harm from cutting healthy genitals, Jonathan was adamant that circumcision doesn't cause anyone any harm. He stuck to this even when I cited the Freedom of Information report from Birmingham, that's the Birmingham, UK, showing that 11 babies had been admitted to the paediatric intensive care unit with life-threatening circumcision complications just the previous year. You can see the bottom figure there in 2011, just in this one hospital alone. So, when we first met, just before the debate, Jonathan looked at me and he said, "Are you Jewish?" Well, I asked you, do I look Jewish? No, I'm not Jewish. My parents were Jewish. I choose my own beliefs. According to most Jewish authorities, a child born to a Jewish mother is Jewish. According to Jewish law number 86, a male child born to Jewish parents should be circumcised on the 8th day of his life. This is just one of 613 central Jewish commandments, mitzvot, some of which would be embraced nowadays as decent behaviour, such as not to take revenge. It's a relief, though, that not all these commandments have survived the test of time intact. For example, number 132, a rape victim is condemned to marry her rapist, or numbers 596 and 597 recommend destroying the 7 Canaanite nations and not to let any of them live. So it's a mixed bag of 613 essential commandments, and I am not going to interpret them. But nowadays, many Jewish authorities do interpret them, so that only about a third are kept in their original form, Brit Shalom being a peaceful variant of number 86 that doesn't hurt children. The thing is, children are not Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Christian at birth, but children of believing parents. And unless we remember this, we risk colluding with the myth that the surgical assignation of a child's body with their assigned religion is somehow okay, might be in the child's best interest. Because, well, they do that in that religion or culture, don't they? And we risk colluding with the myth that any criticism of religious practice is akin to racism. It is not. Denying children of certain races or cultures basic child safeguarding is racist, however subconscious. Ideas and actions are up for debate. Gender, sexuality, skin colour, your whole body, that's just who you are. Anti-Semitism and racism are deplorable, but far too often, though, any criticism of traditional Jewish practice or even Israeli national policy is mischievously conflated with anti-Semitism. I should know. The second time I met with Jonathan was the following year at a head-to-head London University circumcision debate. During questions, Jonathan was asked from the audience whether he thought that people trying to protect boys and girls from cutting were anti-Semitic. His response, which I include verbatim, because Jonathan, a barrister, an attorney, repeatedly threatened to sue me for libel, following my initial website report of his reply, was, "Well, I don't know, but they're all coming out of the woodwork." And besides, the last people who tried to ban circumcision were Hitler and Stalin. So that's the company you're in when you seek to ban it. Ah, classy. Now, setting aside Jonathan's factual inaccuracies about Hitler, who wanted to murder children he considered Jewish, not protect them, in a discussion about the limits of special exemptions granted to wounded children, I believed him to be comparing individuals with Hitler, but was evidently mistaken. He said he was comparing organisations. Silly me. So here's the funny thing. In February this year, Icelandic MP Silja Doc Gunnarsdóttir proposed a bill to extend the protection from forced genital cutting explicitly from girls to boys. Because as we all know, if boys are not mentioned under the umbrella of children, then boys somehow manage to be both children, because they are, and non-children, because they're not afforded gender-neutral child safeguarding protection, all at the same time. No guesses for what I call these boys, Schrodinger's children. Now the BBC invited me back in February to discuss this story on Newsnight, where my opposite number was once again Jonathan. The presenter mentioned that I was from a Jewish background, not something I've ever hidden, and obviously something that Jonathan knew well. And so it was with some surprise that Jonathan bravely stated shortly afterwards on live national television that he had never met a Jewish man who regretted his circumcision. So the whole rationale for performing Brit Milan on an infant is precisely because it's believed the child is inescapably Jewish from birth through to death. Yet should the person, during his own life, later declare himself to be non-Jewish, then his voice is regarded as that of an outsider with the temerity to challenge ancient Jewish sacred traditions. Hey presto, we have a person who is simultaneously cut and branded as a Jew and silenced as a non-Jew. And in this way, the cutting communities silence their critics both from within and without. And so I have Jonathan to thank for helping me to understand the modern phenomenon of Schrodinger's penis. Jewish and not Jewish at one and the same time, outsiders, once insiders, branded at birth, are denied both a foreskin and a voice. We don't know how many, because most slip quietly away unless they accept the label Jewish. And although more boys born to Muslim parents are subjected to forced genital cutting than those born to Jewish parents, the Jewish community is far more vocal and prescriptive about the alleged importance of this ritual than the Muslim community in general. This deeply misguided assumption of infant Judaism is crucial to the debate in Europe, where widely accepted human rights, medical ethics and child safeguarding become muddied, confused and lost by the official Jewish community's righteous indignation with any criticism of their traditional practices, by historical European Holocaust guilt, by the evidently false assumption that all views within a religion are homogenized, and by the convenient, deeply flawed belief that children belong to their assigned parental religion, Judaism or Islam, so that any best interest consideration fails their future by factoring in their parents' beliefs before they can assert their own independent rights. The cutting communities suffer from confirmation bias, cutting all the children they can. Only those who later agree with the cutting are regarded as truly belonging. The views of the owners of a Schrodinger's penis simply do not count. Some people understand this, others don't. Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, was incensed at the idea that Germany, where the Holocaust happened, should impose restrictions on Jewish people. She failed to see that the lesson of the Holocaust was not that Jewish people must get their way, but that vulnerable people should be protected.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And as we know, within 6 months, she pushed through legislation to legalise Brit Milan, thereby sidestepping but not overturning the Cologne judgment. In 2013, in response to a couple of submissions on Israel's compliance with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, a joint effort by Avshalom, who's sitting at the back there, and myself, from Israel, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child placed non-therapeutic circumcision under the heading harmful practices for the first time, and Israel was tasked to report on short and long-term complications, long-term harms, and we'll soon see how they get on with that because they're coming up for review again shortly. Also in 2013, the influential Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe issued Resolution 1952, and they articulated it very well, expressing a particular concern about a category of violation of the physical integrity of children which supporters of the procedures tend to present as beneficial to the children themselves, despite clear evidence to the contrary. This includes, among others, FGM and circumcision of young boys for religious reasons. Predictably, this was condemned as anti-Semitic by world Jewish leaders. And despite later qualifying comments, this still stands, this statement. 2 years ago, the most senior English family judge, James Mumley, recognised that ritual male circumcision constitutes significant harm, which is more harmful than some variants of FGM. We now know that Icelandic politicians have likely bowed to significant pressure from US and Jewish lobbyists, including Jonathan, who visited 3 weeks ago and was seen on the video yesterday morning. Despite the many advances of child rights, many European authorities are still cowed by memories of the awful Holocaust and lose sight of other minorities, particularly minorities within minorities, some of whom also lost relatives in the Holocaust. The thing about Schrödinger's cat is that once you open the box, the paradox resolves. The cat is either dead or alive, not both. It's time to let Schrödinger's cat out of the box and resolve Schrödinger's penis and Schrödinger's children. The biggest threat to safeguarding male children from forced genital cutting in Europe is the spectre of anti-Semitism and the fear of being labelled as anti-Semitic. Letting Schrödinger's cat out of the box resolves the paradox. All children have basic human rights, which aren't dependent on variables such as gender, parental beliefs, recent history, and certainly not on their presumed or assumed beliefs. To mix my metaphors even more, the pond is rippling and we're swimming against the current of post-Holocaust guilt and fear, and with the turning tide of human rights, which is slowly but surely gaining ground both in Europe and here across the pond. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
The screen of this place to mark the proper location.
Circumcision denies a male's right to genital integrity and to a fully functioning penis.
Near the screen of this place to mark the proper location.
Then we clap it.